Good evening and welcome to Talking Sports with Evan. I'm Evan Witalison, your host here tonight on Talking Sports with Evan. Well, clearly it's Talking Sports with Evan. Who else would be your host here tonight besides me? But anyways, thank you so much for those that are watching live, watching later, listening to the podcast later on when I record it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I do greatly appreciate each and every one of you. Lots to discuss here in today's episode of Talking Sports with Evan as the Wisconsin Badgers make a coaching move. Shockingly, well, I'm not surprised they moved on from Paul Chryst. I'm just surprised when they decided to move on from Paul Chryst, as I'm sure a lot of you guys are as well. But I'm going to talk about that move, moving on from longtime Badger head football coach Paul Chryst, and what the future of the Badger program might look like. And McIntosh, he has his work cut out for him to try to find the successor to Paul Chryst, who had been a very successful head football coach at Wisconsin before things started to go wrong. So I'm going to talk about that. The Brewers baseball season is done. I'm going to discuss the year and why the disappointment happened. It's not as cut and dry as some would like to say. Um, they're just not a good team. I'm not buying that. They just had, unfortunately, a lot of bad luck go their way, and they couldn't get it done. And I'm going to discuss what's next for the Brewers, including should Craig Counsell or David Stearns be on the hot seat. So I'm going to discuss that. The Packers are going to London. The Packers are the last team they're the last team in the NFL that has not played in London yet. They get their chance coming up this weekend. I'm going to kind of talk Packers Giants and what the Packers need to do in order to win that game. And it's kind of going to be pretty easy. And I'm going to get to that momentarily in this week's show. I'm going to give you my predictions for this week as well, week 5 of the NFL season. And with that said, again, thank you for tuning in, watching live, streaming it later, whatever your preference is. I do greatly appreciate it. And you're always welcome to follow me on Twitter at Evan Witt Sports or Talking Sports with Evan on Facebook. So I'm going to start with the Wisconsin Badgers. So the Sunday, right around the start of the second half-ish, late second half-ish of the Packer game, word started circulating that the Wisconsin Badgers made a change. They have fired head football coach who is in his 8th season as head coach at Wisconsin, Paul Chryst. They had let him go, and we're looking. Jim Leonard is now the interim head football coach at Wisconsin. And I talked a few weeks ago how I think it's maybe after the Washington State game. I think I talked about how maybe it's time to start thinking about the future as the team looked very unprepared and flat going into a game that they had superior talent to. Ohio State, they got completely boat raced in a game that I at least thought they were going to, backdoor cover. That didn't even happen. And then Illinois team on paper, pure talent wise, the Badgers should win. They came out flat. They came out looking like they didn't want to be there. And former Badger coach Brett Bielema just completely wiped the floor with them. And this isn't the first time the Badgers had looked flat. Go back to last year against Notre Dame, Penn State, Michigan. Same thing happened. Those were all 3 winnable games by Wisconsin last year, but offensively, they looked bored. They looked bored. They looked boring. Graham Mertz hasn't developed the way a lot of people had hoped Graham Mertz was going to develop. The offensive line hasn't developed. Receivers have been slow to develop. And this year, it kind of all came to a head as the Badgers lost a lot of talent on defense last year. So they have a lot of young guys, and then injuries happened. And next thing you know, they're being blown out by Illinois. So to me, this is a sudden move, but it's a long time coming move. I expected it to, if it were to happen, it would happen at the end of the season. I know there are a lot of arguments back and forth about if Chris was on the hot seat or not by beat writers and fans. And unfortunately, the program grew stale, and it was time to make a move. And Paul Chryst was a great hire by Wisconsin when they brought him in to replace Gary Anderson, who tried to radically change Wisconsin, which Wisconsin does need to become more modern. They do need to change things up. They need to improve facilities. They need to change and refocus how they do things. But Gary Anderson tried to do too much too soon. The recruiting restrictions on who he could get into the university became too much for him, and he bolted to Oregon State, left the program in bad shape. He alienated most of the high school coaches in the state of Wisconsin, and it was a mess coming in for Paul Chryst, and he came in and he did a great job developing the guys that Gary Anderson brought in, did a good job of bringing his own guys in, and they peaked in 2019 with a Rose Bowl loss to Oregon. And I guess maybe 2018 when they won the Orange Bowl against Miami. I guess you could kind of say that's when the program peaked, when they beat Miami in the Rose Bowl. I mean, in the Orange Bowl, in their own house, because they've not been as good since. And the biggest issue to me, and you can point at recruiting, and they don't recruit good enough, and they don't recruit like other teams recruit. I know during the Ohio State game, one of the big things that was being talked about and promoted and discussed was Ohio State had like 40 or 50 4- and 5-star guys on their roster, and Wisconsin, or 4-star guys, and Wisconsin had 20. At the end of the day, the whole rating system doesn't mean a lot, because then you have to get these guys in and develop them. And that is something Wisconsin, as far back as Alvarez, has done extremely well. They bring a 2- or 3-star guy in. By the time they leave, they're going to the NFL, or they get to that point where they're potentially being drafted by the NFL. They develop guys. That's what Wisconsin's been known for basically, like I said, since Alvarez. Bielema coached guys up, and they played these games against Michigan tough. They played these games against Ohio State tough, but now they're not. Somewhere after 2018, when the program peaked with that Orange Bowl victory, the development took a step back. And I don't know if it's because certain coaches left and Chris didn't do a good job of filling those positions, but the player development aspect of the program has suffered tremendously. You were producing NFL quality offensive linemen year after year after year after year. And I can't point to a guy on this year's Wisconsin Badger offensive line that's going to be playing on Sundays. And again, they have a 5-star at tackle. I think a couple 5-stars at tackle, a number of 4-stars in the mix at offensive line, but they're not developing. And the growth to me was stunted a lot due to Paul Chryst's loyalty to Joe Rudolph. And he bolted to Virginia Tech. They brought Bob Bostad from the inside linebacker position to the offensive line, back to the offensive line, where he was a really good offensive line coach in the middle 2010s before moving on to the NFL for a bit, before coming back to Wisconsin to coach middle linebacker. I want to give him time to develop that position, because I think he's a really good offensive line coach, and things weren't going to change overnight. But unfortunately for the Badgers, player development has suffered. And the peak of player development suffering is Graham Mertz. 4-star recruit, high 4-star recruit out of Kansas, fringe 5-star guy, was supposed to elevate the program to where they wanted to go, which is compete for Big Ten championships, would put them in position to compete for a national championship. That's what Graham Mertz was supposed to do, and the Badgers didn't develop him. Graham Mertz has a ton of talent. He's got a strong arm. He's a pretty decent athlete. But Wisconsin has done piss poor job developing him over the course of the last 3 years. And that, to me, was the icing on the cake for the Paul Chryst era and why things needed to change. You bring in Bobby Ingram to be the offensive coordinator this year to try to modernize the offense a little bit. You know, Gary Anderson tried doing it too much too soon. This year, they're doing it too slowly, because Paul Chryst handprints were all over the offense of Wisconsin, even with a new guy calling plays. If you're going to bring in a new outsider like that to run your offense, give him a chance to run his offense, which Mertz should be playing more out of the shotgun. He really should. That's just my 2 cents. And I think Jim Leonard has 7 games to step up and show that he can be that next head football coach at Wisconsin, which Wisconsin has been grooming him for, I think, since they brought him into the program back in 2016, I want to say they hired him. They've been grooming him since then to basically take over as head coach someday. And I think one of the biggest reasons why they did it too is they wanted the inside track to hire him. If they wait till towards the end of the year to try to potentially make that move, you have the possibility a school makes a big offer to him going into bowl season if they even sniff a bowl, and Leonard leaves, and now you lose him. And I don't think they wanted to lose him. I think they want to give him the inside shot at that job, and we'll see. Leonard should relate to the players well. He he's 30, mid 30s, something like that. Played in the NFL, played at Wisconsin. He understands the Wisconsin way, and I don't think he's against kind of modernizing some elements to push Wisconsin to being more of a modern offense. So, but Leonard's not the only choice. He's not the only option out there. Big name being thrown around is Lance Leipold. I've heard rumors too that they made the move now to put him in contention for Leipold as probably the biggest competition for Leipold is going to be Nebraska, who made their head coaching decision move a few weeks back, letting Scott Frost go, who has just been a disaster for the Nebraska program. And that's a whole nother show. Nebraska has been pretty much a disaster since they got rid of Frank Solich, who it was the right choice at the right time, is the right vision to let Frank Solich go. But every move after that has been disaster after disaster for Nebraska. So like I said, Nebraska is a whole nother avenue, whole nother ball game to talk about in regards to their program. Wisconsin's in much better shape than Nebraska. I will tell you that much right now. And Nebraska has to get this coaching hire correct if they want to have a chance. Matt Campbell is a name I've seen thrown around from Iowa State. I think he's taken Iowa State as far as he can. He's gone 42-27 over his last 6 seasons, but there's limitations at Iowa State that he might be ready for a next challenge. Jake Dickert, Wisconsin native, played at Stevens Point. Now he's coaching Washington State, had the Cougars 4-1, beat the Badgers. Just 39 years old. He may be willing to come home to Wisconsin. Sean Lewis, head coach at Kent State, former Badger tight end, 36. He's been great at Kent State. Have played teams tough this season. Played Georgia tough before falling 39-22. He's a possibility. Potentially Dave Doran, who was a defensive coordinator under Bielema for a while before going to Northern Illinois. Now he's at NC State. He could be an option. I've seen Thomas Brown, who was a running backs coach for a year at Wisconsin before moving on to Georgia. He was there. Melvin Gordon was the stud running back, Heisman finalist. North Dakota State head football coach, Matt Ince. He's 41-5 with 2 national titles in his stint at North Dakota State. Matt Rule, head coach, Carolina Panthers. He has not been a good NFL head coach at all, but he's a guy that's done really well in the college game. He took Baylor from 1-11 to an 11-win program. So those are some of the names that if it's not Jim Leonard, those are some other names to look at. And I personally believe if it's not Jim Leonard, I think it's going to be Lance Leipold. I know Leipold came out today and said that he's not interested in the job, but I think if it's not Leonard, I think it's Leipold. Leipold is a Wisconsin native. He coached Whitewater, a big winning percentage at Whitewater. I don't think he lost more than 5 games while he was at Whitewater. Won 6 Division III national titles. Has the Jayhawks 5-0. He's shown he can build programs and be an innovator. took Buffalo to a MAC power that finished the top 25 his final season there. The Jayhawks are ranked, they're 12th in scoring offense, and they're ranked nationally for the first time in a very long time. So if it's not Jim Leonard, I think it's going to be Leipold. So that's kind of where I'm at right now with the Badger job. Before I jump to NFL, Brewers, game 162 today. Brewers fall to Arizona 4-2 to end their season at 86-76, 10 games over 500. Other than the COVID year, the Brewers have been an above 500 team every year since 2017. 2020 played a shortened season. Brewers finished, I think, a couple games under 500, but still made the playoffs. First time in 4 years they're not going to the playoffs. So I guess the question is what went wrong? And Craig Counsell is not what went wrong. And I know there's a few games this season that you can point to and say if Counsell would have done this instead of that or that instead of this, they're likely going into the playoffs. I know people criticize him a lot because he doesn't let pitchers go deep enough into games. He pulls them early. Like, I know he pulled Peralta, I think, at 79 pitches before. He's pulled Burns at just under 100 the other day. He pulled Burns after 3 innings today when he had a perfect game through 3 innings going, pulled him out the game. I get that. That's a criticism of Counsell, and I do sometimes wish he would go deeper into games with some guys. Guys like Corbin Burns and Brandon Woodworth, I think, have shown and earned and that right to go deeper in the games if they can. I think they should have more of an input at this point in their careers if they're going to do that. But at the same time, Eric Lauer yesterday at 97 pitches through 6 innings. I know it's easy to say throw him out there for the 7th inning. The season's over anyways. What's the worst that can happen? Well, the problem is Eric Lauer left start 3 or 4 starts ago. I think this is his 3rd start since coming off the IL. We had left elbow discomfort. When you start having left elbow discomfort or right elbow discomfort, if you're a right-hander, typically pretty soon you start having issues and might need Tommy John surgery. So you'd have nothing to lose. But with Eric Lauer, if he goes out and you stretch him out 7th, 8th, or 9th inning, and he throws more pitches and that elbow gives again, now you're talking you don't have him at all for the 2023 season. Now, if the playoffs were still in line and you needed that win, then maybe you push Lauer a little more. But in a game that doesn't matter, you're just trying to finish out the season, that's fine. Same with Corbin Burns. You don't want Corbin Burns to risk a 2023 season-ending injury because you pushed him too hard. So yes, I think that is a valid criticism of Counsell. I do wish you would allow pitchers to pitch deeper in the bigger counts, especially Burns and Woody. But that's just Counsell's way, and it's worked for the Brewers since 2017. This style has worked for Milwaukee, and I know you didn't have a Corbin or a Woody back then, and you needed to, manage games that way, and you have guys that can go deeper, but that's just the Brewers' way. And statistics show that when you go through a batting order for the 3rd time, you are more than likely going to potentially be more likely to give up some hits. But I guess the big question is, what went wrong for Milwaukee? And there's a few things that went wrong, and I know I'm just going to sound like an excuse maker and whatnot, but it's not. These are legit things. The only starting pitcher in your rotation that did not spend any time on the IR was Corbin Burns. Woody spent a good chunk with an ankle injury and then a disorder that he had an issue with his grip. Adrian Hauser had 2 stints on the IL. Eric Lauer had a couple stints. Ashby had a stint. Freddie Peralta had a stint. The starting rotation was on the IL too many times. And the starting pitching was not as good this year as it was last year. If the starting pitching was just half as good as it was last year, we got the Brewers in the playoffs again, more than likely. Bullpen, the Josh Hader trade definitely hurt Milwaukee, but it's not what broke the camel's back. The issues sprung. They had their best 50-game stretch in franchise history, and after that 50-game stretch, they just couldn't get back to that type of baseball where they were winning games at a very high rate. And I think there were 14 or 15 games over 500 at some point during that 50-game stretch because of injuries, because of just not being good enough, because of managing, because of trades the front office made. Lots of reasons why they struggled after Memorial Day. But I think the big one is injuries. And guys who you brought in when you traded Hader, Matt Bush, and Taylor Rogers, guys you brought in to take over for Hader, didn't produce. They didn't perform. And Bush, before the trade, showed that he could be a pretty good pitcher in Texas. Rogers had shown in the past that he could be a pretty good closer in San Diego before he had a rough patch, just like Hader did. But Rogers was too inconsistent. Council maybe used him a little too much against lefties who hit him pretty hard this year. And Matt Bush, when his stuff was on, he was dominant. And then you had Rosenthal, who could never make it. And the trade deadline, the Brewers lost. The Brewers lost the trade deadline. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that David Stearns worked magic and did his thing to bring the Milwaukee Brewers to make them a better team. The Brewers lost the trade deadline. It's that simple. I'm not going to fire David Stearns because of it, but they lost the deadline, and it's very disappointing. But they did. They did not bring in a bat that could help right now. They brought in a bat that can maybe help next year, and they brought in a starting pitcher that could maybe help next year or the year after. So Stearns did not do a great job at the trade deadline. I'm not going to sit around here and pretend and sugarcoat things and everything, and say everything was sunshine and rainbows and all that, because clearly it wasn't. This is a Brewer team that should have competed more for the division and won it, but they didn't, and they're sitting at home while the Cardinals are winning the division. And then they had a lot of guys underproduce. Omar Narvaez, who was offensive power last year, batted around 209. Rowdy Tellez was very streaky. I know he ended the year with 34, 35 home runs, but batting-wise, he wasn't that great. Keston Hiura, who had a great start to his career, his rookie year, has failed to bounce back since. Colton Wong had a down year this year. Luis Urias had a down year. Willy Adames, who I like Willy Adames. I like his energy. I like what he brings you. But he had stretches this year. He had 31 home runs and on 134 hits, 98 RBI. End of the year at 238. But he had stretches where he couldn't get base hits when it mattered most. And, it was sad to see at times. He was a very good defender overall, in my opinion. Some errors early on in the year, but I think they settled down with Willie. But I think Adames just this year with a lot of the players, it was all about that home run or nothing. And I think it hurt Adames when that home run ball wasn't there. He started chasing too much. And that's unfortunately what we saw. And it's, it does suck. So Adames had 14 errors this year. He had 11 last year in Milwaukee. A career high is 17. Ended the year with a .973 fielding percentage. And a lot of his errors happened early in the year. After his rough start to the field this year, to me, he was fine. And I think he'll be fine. He just needs to stop trying to hit for the fences all the time and play hero ball. Just put the barrel of the bat on the ball and see what happens. You can't strike out as much as he has been, and he struck out 165 times this year. A career high, 165 times this year. And he can't do that. He needs to play better. He needs to have that strikeout percentage go down. He struck out 26% of the time this year. That needs to come down a little bit. And like I mentioned, Willie Adames brings a lot of energy. He's a fun player, but he had stretches this year where he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. Andrew McCutchen didn't produce like we hoped he would when they brought him in. Tyrone Taylor has basically been an up and down player. And then the disappointing thing until they moved him to the leadoff spot was Christian Yelich. And this is one of David Stern's faults. David Stearns isn't perfect. I think David Stearns is a really good general manager, but he's not perfect. And the last two seasons, 2021 and 2022, they put the team together like they were expecting Christian Yelich to be able to bounce back and be the Christian Yelich that we saw in 2018 and 2019. That Christian Yelich is gone. The Christian Yelich we see now, they get on base, the high on base percentage, draw a lot of walks, work the counts, leadoff hitter. That's the Christian Yelich we're going to see moving forward. And that's how David Stearns needs to build the team. Not that Christian Yelich is going to be the focal point of an offense. He needs to build it that Christian Yelich is going to be, a on-base guy and put other guys in position to try to drive runs home. Hunter Renfroe, when he was healthy, was a great player, great pickup for Milwaukee. And then Garrett Mitchell, a bit of a slow start to his big league career, and the Brewers brought him up. But he finishes his 61 at-bats that he ended up having in the 2022 season with a stat line of 311, 373, and 832. His last 7 games, 16 plate appearances. He had 7 base hits, batting .438. His last 15 games, .469 on 32 plate appearances, on base of 500, and slugging of .625. And he ends his season, as I mentioned, he played 28 games with a 311, 373, .459 line with 2 home runs and 9 RBIs. I like what I saw from Garrett Mitchell. I think the future for him is very bright. And I think with him, the Brewers' future is very bright. Now, where do the Brewers go next year? I think Colton Wong is likely gone. He's got a player option. So you got to address second base. It could be Terang. It could be Urias, which I don't think Urias should be a starting everyday player. I think he needs to be a utility guy moving forward. He has to push for he has to basically earn playing time based off his performance, which when the Brewers traded for Willie Adames, Urias picked up his game. When they traded for Escobar from the Diamondbacks, Urias picked up his game. He's just one that you need a guy pushing him to be productive. And I don't think he's an everyday player. I really don't. I think he's a great super utility guy. You can play him at short. You can play him at third. You can play him at second. You can give a lot of guys around the infield a day off to manage that 162 games plus playoffs. So third base is a huge position of need for Milwaukee. I know Brasso played pretty decent at times, but Jace Peterson, Mike Brasso, and Luis Urias are not your answers at third base. You need a better third baseman. That's not enough. And first base, I think Rowdy Tellez comes back, but if you can find an upgrade over Rowdy Tellez, then do it. And this is the offseason. The Keston Hiura needs to figure it out. Or I think you look at by the end of spring training, you trade him for whatever you can get at that point. Outfield wise, I think Yelich needs to probably move to DH because I think he's too valuable for you as a hitter, but he doesn't really have the arm anymore to play outfield. I think Garrett Mitchell has earned the right to earn that starting center field position with Tyrone being spelling him. I think Hunter Renfroe, you bring him back. I think Hunter Renfroe, he's got another couple years of arbitration. I think he's earned the opportunity to come back. But the Brewers need to look to upgrade left field. If you move Yelich to DH, they need to upgrade third base tremendously. Second base, assuming Colton Wong leaves, you need a guy there. And then catching position. I think Caratini you keep as your backup, but you got to find a new frontline catcher. And then bullpen. You need to restock that bullpen. Really dependable, you have Devin Williams and Boxberger. Trevor Gott up and down all year. Hobie Milner up and down all year. I think they found something in Peter Shizelecki. He earned his first save yesterday. I think they have something in Justin Topa potentially, but I think you definitely have to improve that bullpen. And I think you got to bring Craig Counsell back. I think Counsell earns another year to, obviously his seat's getting warmer, but I think Counsell earned another year to try to determine if he is the right guy to push this team over the top. Because Counsell is a hell of a manager and does a lot with very little. David Stearns, it might be because he has limitations put on him from Antanasio, the owner, but David Stearns doesn't give him the best stuff to work with. Antanasio probably doesn't spend as much as he probably could. And I think Counsell gets the most I think he gets the most with what he's got. And I think you need to upgrade third base, second base, catcher, and left field, and move Yelich to DH as we move forward in the 2023 season. And you give Counsell another shot there as your manager. I don't think it's time to let Counsell go yet. So moving on to the NFL. And if you think I'm an idiot and you think I'm a moron, tell me. If you think I'm a moron, tell me. I was wrong about the Brewers being a playoff team this year. I projected that they were going to win the division, have about 93-ish wins. Cardinals would finish second, and I was clearly wrong. And I thought they still had a chance a couple weeks ago at clinching that wild card, and clearly I was wrong there. So I'm saying right now I was wrong, and Scott, you are 100% correct. So you were not high on this Brewer team, and obviously I should have listened to you a little bit more on your assessment of this team. But I don't think the team's that far off from getting back into the postseason contention. They don't have to do a drastic overhaul. They just have to do some retooling at some spots and see what happens in 2023. That's kind of where I'm at. Packers beat the Patriots last week in overtime, and I know a lot of people are whining about the quality way they won, needing a field goal in overtime to win 27-24. But it's week 4. You're still figuring out your offensive identity. Without Devontae Adams, you're still figuring out your offensive line with getting Bakhtiari back and Elton Jenkins back. Your interior, especially Runyon Jr., has been incredible. He's not given up any kind of pressure yet this season at all. He's the only guard in the NFL that has 0 pressures allowed at this point of the season. Runyon's done great. And I know there's lots of talk about moving Elton Jenkins back inside because he hasn't looked great at right tackle so far. If they do that, put him at the right side. Put Yash Nyman at right tackle, put Jenkins at right guard. I don't think you mess around with Runyon at this point. He's been playing left now since last year, every down. I think you keep him at left guard because he's a really good player, and I don't think you just mess around with that at all. But the Packers got the win. Rodgers looked not good at all in the first half, but he looked great in the second half. He's learning his personnel. He's figuring out what Romeo Doubs can offer. He's figuring out what Christian Watson can offer. And Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon are 2 really good backs. And Jones should be the focal point of this offense, especially until Rodgers figures out what exactly these receivers offer and the offensive line gets a little bit more comfortable playing with one another. But hey, it's the National Football League. It's tough to win in the NFL. I would have loved to beat the Patriots 35-0. But it's the NFL, and yes, there are concerns they need to correct, and this is the time in the season you correct them. So obviously the Packers need to do a better job of stopping the run, and that starts with Devondre Campbell. He's not been He hasn't been awful, but he's not been as good as he was last year. I think he has 6 missed tackles on the year already. And last year he had 6 all of last season. So he needs to do a better job. Quay Walker's still getting his feet wet. He could do better against the run, but he's been a great addition with the passing game. But as a rookie, that's going to develop over time. No, it wasn't a bad pick by Goot. The linemen could do better, but again, they didn't need him to show up and be a dominant player right away. They had Kenny Clark and Reed to kind of help him ease into the NFL. And unfortunately, he hasn't produced as quickly as we hoped. But I'm not giving up on 2 first-round picks now. Because if we would have done that, we would have gave up on Rashawn Gary after his rookie year. And Rashawn Gary has an inside track, a prediction I made of winning Defensive Player of the Year, 5 sacks through 4 games. He's got a sack in every game of this season, at least 1 sack. Gary's becoming that dominant edge rusher that we were hoping he was going to be when they drafted him. And he's very stout against the run, and he's a great pass rusher. But yeah, the Packers have to do better against the run, and they should have boat raced the Patriots. But like I said, winning in the NFL is hard. And this week they fly across the pond to London to take on the New York Football Giants, who could be playing with their 3rd-string quarterback due to injury. Daniel Jones, Tyrod Taylor, limited and did not participate in practice this week. So the Packers' defensive game plan should be simple. We're loading up to stop Saquon Barkley, and that's who we're focused on. And I think the Packers are clearly the better team than the New York Giants. The Packers should win this game. I know playing in London brings its difficulties. Playing in London brings its issues, but I think the Packers should beat the Giants, to me, quite handedly, and the Packers hopefully get their first big win of the year playing in front of this London crowd. Keys to victory, Rodgers continuing to grow with the receivers and trying to get the ball to Romeo Doubs. I don't think there's too many players on the Giants that can stop him, and continue to feed the ball with Aaron Jones and make him the centerpiece of the offense. Other games going on around the NFL, Colts and Broncos, Thursday Night Football. I think the Broncos are going to get the win. The Colts have not looked good at all. Now Jonathan Taylor is out, and it'd be interesting to see what happens with no Jonathan Taylor. Matt Ryan has not looked good. Lions, Patriots. I think the Lions get the victory in New England. Lions are offensively have been really good. Defensively, they've been struggling, but they may be going up against a 3rd-string quarterback as well. I think they get this victory. The Chargers beat the Browns in Cleveland. I think the Chargers are just a better team overall, and I think they get that win. The Jaguars beat up on the Texans. The Buccaneers squeak by Atlanta. Yes, squeak by Atlanta. The Bills beat the Steelers pretty handedly. The Dolphins squeak by the Jets without Tua. I just think the Jets, being the Dolphins, are the better team. The Vikings beat the Bears. The Titans beat the Commanders. The Seahawks beat the Saints. 49ers beat the Panthers. The Eagles beat the Cardinals. Rude awakening time for Cowboys quarterback, who's filling in for Dak Prescott, as the Rams beat the Cowboys in pretty easy fashion. And then the Ravens beat the Bengals, and the Chiefs beat the Raiders. So with that said, thank you so much for listening in to the show. I appreciate it. This has been Talking Sports with Evan. You can find me on Twitter at EvanWithSports, or on Facebook, Talking Sports with Evan. Interact with me. Tell me I'm an idiot for my Brewer position. That's fine. Until next week, hopefully talking about another Packer victory. I will talk to you all later.